everyone, and welcome to another Fresh Fiction Video Book Club. I'm Samantha T, and today's guest is truly a lady of mystery, Delia Pitts. Delia, I'm so glad to have you and talk to you about your new series and the kickoff book, The Trouble in Queenstown. Glad to have you.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Well, Delia, for some of our readers who might be new to you, tell us a little bit about yourself and how did you first get started writing? Because you have a fascinating history of basically your life before you started officially publishing.
Yes, well, thank you for asking. I always say that, and this is not an exaggeration, I sold my first story when I was in second grade. I wrote a story about a horse and made the cover art, finger painted the cover art, and sold it for 2 cents in our school's spring fair. So I consider that that was the start of my professional writing career. But seriously, no, I did several other things. I worked as a journalist in my hometown, which is Chicago. I also got a Ph.D. at the University of Chicago in African history. And then I joined the United States Foreign Service. And my husband and I served for many years in a variety of different countries, working in the U.S. embassies overseas. We served in Lagos, Nigeria. We served in Nouakchott, Mauritania. And we also served in Mexico City. And then in between those overseas assignments, I worked in the State Department in Washington, D.C. on a number of cultural affairs bureaus for Latin America and for Africa. Then I moved to sort of redeem my academic background and moved into university administration. And I'm excited to say that I worked for many years at TCU in Fort Worth. We raised my sons there. I have twin sons, and one of them went himself to TCU and is still living in Fort Worth. And the other son, still a Texan, moved to Austin, Texas after he went to college out of state. So I feel like I have a lot of strong Texas ties, although at the beginning of this current century, we moved to New Jersey, which is where I live now. And I worked for another university also as an administrator. And then I retired. And at that point, I said, what am I going to do next? And I guess I thought back to my second grade self, and I decided that I wanted to write. And specifically, I wanted to write crime stories. I've always been fascinated by film noir, by the movies that I watch on TCM constantly. All of them are on the darker side of crime fiction, and I've always loved that. But also, I always loved the golden age of crime fiction, the Agatha Christie's, Dorothy L. Sayers, Ngaio Marsh, and I came more recently to liking and reading some of the American golden age of crime fictions, the Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler. And I always was fascinated by that form, that genre, and I decided to take my hand at it, and here I am.
Well, what do you think is it that appeals to you so much of those different noir fiction type books? And especially considering your background, where to me, grouping all of those different rules together, I mean, there's so many different elements of, and this is definitely overstating it, but kind of the people watching and the interaction of so many different cultures and the observance of different personalities from being in the with different foreign affairs element, but then also the universities. Where do you think that tie in, or do you think your love of film noir or the mystery noir is something unique and completely separate?
No, I think you've hit right on it. I think it's very much connected. I think that the both my academic and journalism backgrounds definitely played into questions of how does one observe, how does one listen, how does one write about what and capture in meaningful ways what you've heard or what you've learned in a variety of contexts, sometimes formal meetings, sometimes very informal at a dinner party. as a Foreign Service officer, we had to keep track of things that we heard at receptions, at dinners, at gatherings that were quite informal. And we often had to go back at the end of that evening and write it up. And of course, you're not sitting there at a dinner table with a pad and paper taking notes. And so a lot of the skills I find that I developed as a Foreign Service officer, as a diplomat, included things like, I wouldn't say memorizing exactly, but trying to memorize and capture large swaths of dialogue, capturing the nuances of what people were saying underneath what they were saying. Those kinds of skills were very important in my diplomatic career, and they definitely play a major role in what I try to do with my fiction writing today.
I'm fascinated by the diplomat element, especially being stationed in these different countries and regions that of themselves are very different. So did you get this? I realize this is a complete tangent from your writing, but did you find that you had to exhibit different skills and as you were trying to understand, or like you said, being able to report out from when you were in each of these different areas?
Well, yes, you certainly have to develop language skills, and I worked hard at learning French, at learning Spanish for when I was in Mexico City. But also, I think you have to learn the ways that people communicate. People share their stories. People talk about what's important to them in ways that are different and differ from culture to culture, from country to country. And that's something that, again, I've tried to bring into my current fiction career. I've tried to capture the diversity of people's approaches to telling their own stories, the voices that you have to capture when you're a diplomat. You have to be able to hear what people are saying. It's not always what they said, it may be what they mean. You have to capture that, and that's the subtext, as we would say in the literary business, but it's very relevant to what I was doing as a diplomat as well. Also, we did a lot of writing as a diplomat. I wrote memos, but I also wrote speeches for ambassadors and all of my bosses. I was always a pretty junior officer, and so I was always tasked with writing and revising and rewriting and rewriting again. And what I found important about that kind of writing is that you're trying to capture a voice that is not your own. I was not writing a speech for the ambassador that would sound like Delia, because that's not what the job was. I was trying to capture her jokes, her thoughts, her background, her vocabulary, his emphasis, his patterns of speech, and put those into the presentation that I was writing for them. And again, I found that kind of work, that exercise, that skill to be very, very relevant to developing the voice for fiction that I now write.
That's so interesting, and that's a different aspect of the reports compared to other diplomat or past diplomats and analysts that we've talked to, where sometimes they have focused on the ability to summarize and be able to write a concise report. But I think this is the first time where I've heard somebody talk about capturing the voice and the intent with the people that you're engaged with, either by preparing speeches or even from getting the input from others. And you're right, I think that would be so critical, and I can see that tie over into any type of fiction writer. I'm fascinated by that. As to, I mean, did you find when you were doing that, because of some of the concise nature that you have to do in those types of reports, was it easier to capture that voice, or did you find it more difficult, or was that just a natural extension, you think, of how you were hearing things?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that being concise, being even terse, was very important, very valued. No one, when you're writing a report on, let's say, a spot reporting on an event that you attended or something that you witnessed, a demonstration, a meeting in the town or the city or the country that you're living in, people don't want a 55-page rumination from you. They want a terse, to the point report that gets at the top most important elements first, and then elaborates on those elements as you go further into the report. And so I think that you're absolutely right that it was important, if you wanted to get ahead as a diplomat, to be able to master a style that was concise, that was accurate, that was had a little bit of style to it, because it's noted who the good writers are and who the not so good writers are, and you can build a reputation like that even in the Department of State, for being a good writer. And I think those all played in to my current writing. I don't see this as, I see it as not as seamless. I see that a writing is writing is writing is writing, and all aspects of writing are feeding into the basic job of getting a story and getting it on paper and getting it, then sharing it with the readers.
Now, on one hand, I like to agree the writing is writing is writing. On the other hand, it's one I struggle with because when I am having to write things for my day job, and I'm an engineer, and
Mhm.
depending on who my audience is, sometimes I've been told it's not Shakespeare, Samantha, get to the point, right?
That's
And
right.
so there's different styles that I have to write it for some of those presentations or even an email. It's like, okay, get down to what are the basics. And other times I do need to expand as to, okay, here's all the different flourishes of what's going on. But I think this is the other aspect of your background that I'm really interested in, is because you've had so many different elements where writing has come into play before being a published author of novels, is that because you did work with newspapers, right? And then
Yes.
of course we were talking about being in the foreign affairs. University always there's writing. I mean, that's the
Yes.
nature of universities, no matter what the position. But then you also did fan fiction. So
Yes.
how do you think the writing is different between all of those various elements? And what do you think that you took from all of those, or that you needed to adapt when you started actually publishing novels?
I think the difference between them is that in the first parts of the career that you outlined there, I was working in a world that wasn't my creation, of course. I was reporting on or responding to events happening in the world around me, either as a journalist or as a diplomat, or, as you said, as a university administrator, going to countless faculty meetings. When you get into fan fiction, or you get into the longer fiction that I then turned to, that's where world building itself comes in. And I found that to be a wonderful and fascinating and challenging aspect of the kind of writing that I do now, that I get to play in a world that I've created with characters, of course, that I've invented. And I find that absolutely enchanting, and I love that. But it's quite different from the kinds of writing that I did in my previous careers.
What was the initial inspiration behind the Ross Agency?
The Ross Agency series, I have 6 books in
Yeah,
that
yeah,
series,
with your Ross Agency.
right, with the Ross Agency books. My thought there was to play with the stereotypes of the private investigator and bend them and twist them in new ways. And I wanted to, instead of having the private eye be a lone wolf, super masculine with all the cars and the gadgets and the women and the money, I wanted to make a different kind of private eye. I wanted to have him embedded in a very tiny neighborhood detective agency set in Harlem, the unofficial capital of Black America, you could say. And I wanted him to be a wounded war veteran. It's a contemporary story, so he was an Iraq war veteran. I wanted him to be, well, I had to make him very, very handsome, but I wanted him to be a one-woman man. He was not horn dogging around. He didn't have a car. He had a limp. He did not use a gun, and that was very purposeful because he'd seen the damage that a gun can do. And he absolutely believed that a gun was an invitation to violence, and he was not going to dance at that party. And so I wanted to take some of the tropes that one finds in the classic private investigator novels or films and turn them on their head. And I also wanted to get at something that I think Darla and several of the other people who spoke earlier with our group spoke about. What is the investigator doing? And I thought it was very important that we note the way a private investigator fills in the gaps in the pursuit of justice. And particularly for the Harlem-based series, I wanted to focus on the neighborhood, and I wanted to say, who is it in that neighborhood that deals with the issues and the problems of ordinary residents, issues and concerns and worries and pressures that fall below the radar of the police, and who solves their problems. You can imagine any number of issues that could come up, from private parties that need security, to a runaway spouse, to a missing child who's an adult, to someone who may have missed or mislaid jewelry in their home, all kinds of things, to a missing cat. Who solves those problems? Who answers those questions? They're very real questions. They're very urgent questions for the people involved. But typically, that's not something that standard law enforcement is going to be bothered with. But these are questions that I thought it made sense to consider a neighborhood private agency, private security agency, which addressed exactly those concerns.
And I think those are some themes that also transfer over to your new series and the new book with the Trouble in Queenstown. But one of the things that I also find fascinating, and I'm really curious about, is that in the Ross Agency mysteries, you have a male protagonist
Mhm.
with SJ. But now, of course, in Trouble in Queenstown, you have a female PI with Vandy. So what has been, and it's, I think it's so interesting because you are a woman. And so a lot of women writers that we talk to, they tend to have strong female protagonists. But you started with a male. And so with that, what did you find to be the differences between writing a male lead character as your main protagonist to switching to a female who's also a PI, but a different set of concerns? Was that challenging? Was it more natural? Was that a something that you really felt strongly that you needed to do? Or why did you start with the male and then versus female? I just find this so curious all the way around.
Yes, you've asked a number of really good questions. Some of them I still ask myself. I started with the male because that's the way I heard the voice. That's the voice that came to my head. Rook's voice came to my head, and he was a tough guy, with a delicate inner life, and that's what came to me when I wrote the series that features the Harlem detective. When I turned to writing the Queenstown book, Trouble in Queenstown, and it will have a sequel. I wanted a different kind of character, so I turned a lot of those cliches and tropes on their head. I had actually a marvelous time switching from writing a male voice to writing a woman's voice. It was not necessarily easier, either one. I would say both are difficult, but I wanted very much to find the differences between those two private detectives. And one of the ways I did, I played myself a little exercise. I had the two characters meet in a short story. I called it Busted Flat in Queenstown. And it's a short story in which Rook, the first character, is driving, he's returning from a case, and he has a flat tire in Queenstown. And who does he meet? The only Black woman detective in Queenstown. And they hit it off, and they end up going on a little short case together. And that was a wonderful exercise for me in having my two main characters in dialogue together, and having as an exercise for myself to say, how do they speak and distinguish their modes of speech, distinguish their approach to surveillance, their approach to intervention in action situations. Their vocabulary is different because their experiences are different. Vandy Myrick is not a war veteran. She's a law enforcement officer. She is a woman. She's a mother. She is a daughter with a very important relationship to her father. None of these are things that are true of the previous detective. And so out of the attributes that I built for her came her vocabulary and came her voice. I did keep a couple of traits similar. She too does not carry a gun. I think that was also very important. And it gave me a challenge because obviously one of the easiest ways to resolve a difficult situation in a detective story is to shoot your way out of the difficulty, out of the bar scene or out of the tight fix that you found yourself in. Just pick up your gun and shoot. I purposefully set myself the challenge. How do my detectives get out of a really bad situation using their brains and their fists and their smart mouths if they need to? And that was one of the carryovers to the Trouble in Queenstown, was that affinity for looking for non-gun related situations that could be resolved, not necessarily without violence, but resolved without guns.
And I have to say that, I mean, you grabbed me by the very first sentence of this book. I admit, I picked it up, and we're not spoiling things for people because it's the very first sentence. But the very first sentence was, I was horny. And it was like, whoa, wait a minute. This is not what I was expecting. What's going on? What?
Who is this? Who is this? And why is she saying these things? And most of all, how's she going to resolve that?
Right?
Yeah.
So you definitely grabbed my, kept it. Good. But I was like, whoa, wait a minute.
Well, she's a woman of middle age, of a certain age. She's 47 years old. She keeps herself in good shape. She has a presence. She's divorced. As I said, she's a mother, and she knows what she wants in all areas of her life, including her social life. And she goes for what she wants. And that was a good way for me to quickly get into the character and get some of her ways of moving in the world. That she is not someone who hangs back. She's not someone who is particularly shy about her own interests, her own needs, her own concerns. And she also has a huge path to walk as she moves out of grief. And she recognizes that part of what she does is forms of detachment from the world, that she's not ready yet to engage in some more meaningful ways with the world. She's suffered a lot, and she relies on her circle of resilience, a group of women who support her, who back her, who give her a structure for her life as she rebuilds it. But she knows that the actual resilience has to come from inside her. And so we watch that develop and grow through the course of the novel.
What is it that comes to you first? Is it the characters or the plot and the story?
It's definitely, for me, the characters and the character voice. The character voice comes very strongly in me, almost to the point of demanding to be put on paper or onto the screen. And so I very much hear the voice and the character first. In this particular case, I have to say that I've carried with me for a long time, decades now, a fascination with a woman as a private investigator. My cousin, whose name is Esther Myrick, who is older than me, still alive, still very vigorous in Chicago, where we grew up. She was my my father's side of the family. She in the 1970s, she and her husband started a small security firm on Chicago's South Side. And it, as far as I know, never handled the kind of dire and gritty cases that I worked into Trouble in Queenstown. But I think she did do a lot of the more routine kinds of private security work, providing protection service for banks and for other kinds of offices, doing investigation on insurance scams, certainly doing investigations involved with disability claims or job applications or divorce cases, those kinds of more bread and butter cases. But what really struck me about Esther's work was that this was a younger Black woman in the 1970s and 80s taking up an unusual position as a self-employed business owner on the south side of Chicago. And that I carry that with me. And that's why obviously I used her name, Myrick, as and applied that to my character, Vandy. And Esther is not like Vandy in many ways, but she has the grit and the determination and the fire that I tried to bring to Vandy. So very much that character, the Vandy character, and the notion of a Black woman who could be a successful private investigator was with me for a long time.
Delia, I want to switch over and let's see if we can get some of our fresh fiction facts in. These are some rapid fire questions off the top of your head for answers, okay? Who would you most want to be stuck in an elevator with?
Oh, my goodness. Right now, Kamala Harris.
That would certainly be a fascinating discussion.
Yes, I'd love it.
Right? Oh, gosh, to be a fly on the wall right there. What luxury item can you not live without?
I have a fetish for purses and shoes. I have to admit, not all of them, I go up and down the scale in terms of how much they are worth. I will spend a lot of money and I'll spend a little money, but I will always spend on purses and on shoes.
I can relate to that, yes. Then I purchase them and then I end up being stuck and using the same thing over and over again. But my
There you go.
closet looks fascinating,
Yes.
right? Okay, other than books, what is something that you own a ridiculous amount of?
Probably makeup. I have a ridiculous amount of makeup for someone who probably 3 days out of the week, 3 or 4 days, doesn't wear makeup at all. But I enjoy buying it. I enjoy experimenting with it. It's playtime for me. And I have a ridiculous amount of makeup.
You've been kidnapped, but they return you 2 hours later because you will not stop talking about what?
Probably about baseball. I love talking about baseball. I have since I was a child in Chicago on the South Side when I was a White Sox fan, and I still follow Chicago. The Chicago teams are not doing well this year, but I am very dedicated to following the Mets and the Yankees and the Phillies, which are the three teams that are right around me in central New Jersey, and I follow that fairly closely.
Wait, are you telling me you did not adopt the Rangers as one of your teams despite your time at TCU?
Uh,
Oh,
no, I could still do the Horn Frogs and say some of the chants, but no, baseball was always
okay.
my love.
What is your most dog-eared reread book? The one that you keep going back to, either for research or for pleasure?
Probably the two books that I go back to most frequently are Alice in Wonderland and the short stories of Arthur Conan Doyle, the Sherlock Holmes stories. I read them over and over again. I probably read Alice in Wonderland at least once a year. I find the vocabulary, the language, the jokes endlessly fascinating. I love it. And I find the stories of Sherlock Holmes infinitely inspiring. So I read them again and again.
Now, and it's curious with both of those. And so, are you reading them from in their original form, or do you also find yourself going to different adaptations and other versions that have gotten published over the years?
Well, you mentioned earlier fan fiction, and one of the ways I got into fan fiction was following all the pastiches of Sherlock Holmes stories. Laurie R. King, I loved all of her books from the beginning with The Beekeeper's Apprentice. I loved all the stories that have to take the world of Sherlock Holmes and then twist it, make it slightly different, update it, take a different aspect of his personality or his relationship with Watson and turn it a bit. I love reading all of that newer fiction that is based on the original canon stories, but I also love the originals.
Because I think both of those, it's so fascinating because there have been so many different versions of those. I mean, especially with Alice, right? I mean, because you have the Disney ones that a lot of people were first introduced, and
Mhm.
then you go back and you read the original books by Lewis Carroll, and you're like, wow, this is a completely
Yes,
different story, essentially. And just the characters, I mean, and again, it's the same thing also with Sherlock. I mean, everything that you mentioned, and it's a character really that's been adapted and integrated into so many other works of fiction. I think more so than probably almost any other character or set of novels.
I think that's for sure. I think that's for sure. How important, speaking of private detectives, is the first private consulting detective, Sherlock Holmes, in setting for us the whole way of interacting both with the client, with the official police, with people that he investigates, his whole role as an avenging angel at times, also as a judge, his role set apart and away from and above society as he looks into the cases that he solves. He chooses which cases. He does it not for money. He does it for curiosity, for intellectual stimulation, and he sets that as the requirements that all the rest of us who write crime fiction, and particularly who write about private detectives, have to respond to Sherlock Holmes in one way or another. Either we have our characters who are imitating him and who follow in his footsteps, or ones who turn him on his ear and take away some of the conventions that Conan Doyle introduced us to and shred them and then remix them and put them back together. And so, absolutely, I think you have to know the canon. You have to know where it comes from as you then move forward with new ways of approaching those concerns.
Is there an author that you feel you just have to read all of their work, find their entire backlist, or purchase every new book as soon as it comes out?
Certainly, there are a number that are writing today that I absolutely feel that way. S.A. Cosby is one. I have to read all of the books that he puts out. Razor Blade was probably my favorite, but there have been a number of his, all of his I read. I love the work of Tracy Clark. She writes a series based in my hometown. She has written some series which focus on woman private detective. She also writes a series, which she's doing now, on a woman police officer, police detective. And her writing is crisp, her plotting is spectacular, and she really captures the feeling of Chicago. I also will never miss a new book by Kelly Garrett, whose most recent book is Missing White Woman, but her previous book last year was really outstanding, Like a Sister. So I always will read her stories. I love the books by John Copenhaver, who writes books about their historical fiction, historical crime stories set in the 1950s, and they look at several queer characters and how the moral standards of the 1950s restricted their lives and their and threatened, of course, their lives in many dire ways. And he does a fabulous job. Is an historical crime fiction. I love those, and I will always read his books, John Copenhaver, as well. There are a lot of them. There's a lot of books that I love in the crime field. Margaret Duahi is another excellent newer writer, again writing a female private detective, but her second book is Sacred Water, just came out a few months ago, and they're set in New Orleans, another city I absolutely love. Her private detective, her amateur detective, is a lesbian nun with tattoos who's a rock star before she comes into the convent, and she solves a number of cases that are based in her faith community. And it's Margot Duahi is a poet. You can see that in her writing, which is absolutely brilliant, and again, not to be missed.
Well, Dia, as readers, we're always wanting to know, what are you working on next? So what is the best way for our readers and listeners to keep up with you and find out everything that you're working on?
I think the best way is to go to my website, deliapitts.com. I try to keep that up to date. I'm probably not as good as I should be, but I do keep up to date there. I'm working right now on a number of short stories that will be coming out. I love the shorter form, and I'm working on a sequel to Trouble in Queenstown. And so I'm hopeful and excited about that new book. It should be out this time next year. And I think I don't think I'm violating any secrets by saying that the next title for the new Vandy Myrick book will be called Death of an Ex. And that
Now, see,
tells you
that
actually quite a lot.
is a key.
Death of an Ex, EX, that's right.
Well, Delia, it was so great to talk with you this evening, but stick around for the after party where our readers who are joining us live will be able to ask you a couple additional questions. And for those who are joining us online, be sure and check out Delia's latest book, Trouble in Queenstown. Thanks again for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed this.